I often get asked, why does a starter need to have discards? It just seems so wasteful. I'm going to share with you the answer. Discards and feedings are typically done together when developing a brand new starter and or reviving an old neglected starter. These are the top 3 things discarding does. 1. Discarding keeps the volume or quantity of the sourdough starter under control. 2. Feeding a starter by discarding creates less waste than if no discard were done. 3. Discarding accompanied by a good feeding protocol can bolster the strength and vitality of a starter, giving you better bread. I'm going to give examples of each of those 3 points. First, let's have a quick review of the microbes that make up a sourdough starter, since discarding and certain feeding protocols affect these microorganisms, which ultimately will make or break your sourdough starter. A sourdough starter contains both yeast and bacteria. The bacteria, predominantly a type called lactobacillus, feed on the natural sugars in the flour. The bacteria are essential to the fermentation process, and the lactobacillus release lactic acid as their byproduct. This acid gives sourdough that signature tangy flavor. The yeasts also consume the natural sugars in the flour. However, they release carbon dioxide and alcohol as their byproducts. The CO2 or carbon dioxide gases are responsible for raising the dough. And P.S. If you're concerned about the alcohol byproduct, have no worries. After the bread goes through the fermentation and baking process, there is none remaining, or at least extremely nominal. So much so that a bite of banana has more than a slice of sourdough. Here's how discarding keeps the sourdough quantity controlled and minimizes flour and water waste. Let's say you have a jar of 50 grams of starter and you don't discard when feeding it. To feed that 50 grams of starter, you will need to add a minimum of equal weight flour and water in order for there to be enough food for the microbes. In this case, 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water will be added to the 50 grams of starter. And just an FYI, this is called a 1:1:1 ratio, since the starter and flour and water are all of equal proportion. That 50 grams of starter plus 50 grams of flour plus 50 grams of water now creates a starter mixture that is 150 grams in weight. If no discard is done with the next feeding, that 150 grams of starter will need a minimum of equal weight flour and water for adequate food. Therefore, 150 grams of flour plus 150 grams of water will be added to the 150 grams of starter, creating a mixture that is now 450 grams in total weight. If this feeding ratio continues without discarding, by the 5th feeding you will have over 12,000 grams or 50 cups of starter, which is ridiculously excessive in both quantity and resources. If you didn't match the flour and the water weight to the starter, rather you just kept feeding the increasing amount of starter with only 50 grams of flour and water each day, this would not be enough food to sustain the ever-growing population of microbes, and the starter would fizzle out due to the lack of food. Now let's look at an example if you did discard. Let's say that you have a jar of 50 grams of starter. You remove half, which is 25 grams, and place it into a new jar while discarding the remaining amount. Then you feed that 25 grams of starter, 25 grams of flour, and 25 grams of water. You now have a mixture that has a total weight of 75 grams. When the starter is fed again using the exact same process of saving 25 grams of starter while discarding the rest, then feeding an equal weight of 25 grams flour and water, the total volume or weight holds the same as the day before at 75 grams. The quantity of the starter never grows to excessive amounts nor uses excessive flour and water as compared to the non-discarding example. And for me, I discard mine into the garden compost or repurpose it into a recipe like pancakes. So if you utilize the discarded starter in those ways, there's actually zero waste. Now, let's take a look at how discarding can do more than keep the starter quantity controlled and save on resources. By using a 1:2:2 feeding ratio, both a brand new starter and an old neglected starter can be bolstered into super strength and vitality. This is how. Let's say that you have a jar that contains 50 grams of starter. old or new. You remove half, which is 25 grams, and place it into a new jar while discarding the remaining amount. Then feed that 25 grams of starter with double the amount of flour and water. In this case, 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. With each additional feeding, you'd repeat the same routine of discarding, then feeding double the flour and water. So how does this doubling of flour and water help create sourdough super strength or resurrect a neglected starter? With the doubling of the flour and the water, the microbes of the starter now have more food available to them than if only fed an equal weight for the same population. To bolster the starter even more, I recommend discarding before the 1:2:2 ratio feeding. More food available to the smaller microbe population creates less competition and greater strength, whereas less food available because of a larger microbe population creates more competition and ultimately less strength. A healthy and vital sourdough starter is all about strength. Another benefit of discarding is that it helps keep the bacteria's acid byproducts and the yeast's alcohol byproducts from building up in the starter. If you keep feeding and not discarding, the acids and the alcohols will accumulate. Too much acid can hinder the yeast, too much alcohol can hinder the bacteria. The whole microbial balance thing can just be thrown off. Discarding helps maintain balance and even create balance. A balanced starter is a healthy starter, and a healthy starter is a strong starter. To supercharge your starter, I suggest a protocol in my sourdough starter guide using a series of discards accompanied by a 1:2:2 feeding ratio. This supercharge method can be used at the end of a 7 or 8 day development of a brand new starter, and the same method can be applied to revive a starter back to life that perhaps been neglected in the fridge for a few months and hasn't been fed, looks pretty hopeless. When a mature and healthy starter is regularly used, meaning once a week or more, its strength and balance is usually in top form. However, if that mature starter ever seems to lose some of its zeal, a series of discarding and feedings, as given in my Supercharge protocol, can boost that starter back to full strength and vigor in just a matter of days. If you found this content helpful, I would be honored if you considered buying me a cup of tea. Your $5 donation supports me and my channel so I can continue making free videos like this one and helping people with their sourdough making and fermenting journey for better health and well-being. Plus, it's a lot of fun. Speaking of videos, check out my sourdough playlist that includes videos on how to make a sourdough starter from scratch, how to make sourdough bread for beginners step by step, and a starter troubleshooting guide. All of those videos can be found right here or as a link in the description. You can also browse my favorite sourdough baking supplies on my website at cleanfoodliving.net. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.